The technological examination of a work of art has become very important for art history. And so I want to talk to you about some of the ways that technology is used with art history. And as you can see, I have a list of different ways to examine a work of art. And the first one would be the visual examination of the visible surface. Now, that's not technology. That people have been doing since they first created works of art. They've been looking at works of art. Art historians often look, of course, very carefully at the work of art, studying all the details. And there's many, many things you can learn from a visual examination of the surface of the work of art. Of course, you can learn more things as you go beneath the surface, as we will soon see. But you can look at a work of art, and if you have really studied the works of particular artists, an art historian could attribute a work to a particular artist. In other words, they say, this painting is by this artist or by this artist's workshop, or however they're doing it. Now, we don't always have the names of artists. So you could say this work of art is by the same artist who painted these other works of art, a group of similar works, because they've examined the stylistic details, and they believe that these are the same person, or at least the same person's workshop anyway. And when we don't know the artist's name, we give them a conventional name. Usually it's after some aspect of the work of art. For example, if somebody painted the Legend of St. Lucy, and we might call them, there is such a person, who's called the Master of the Legend of St. Lucy. There were actually two masters of the Ursula legend, one in Germany and one in Bruges in Flanders. That's one thing you can do. And of course, just studying and looking, you will find many, many things, just looking at the visible surface. Okay, but we can also look beneath the surface. Now, not everybody can do all of these things. Some of them require a lot of training. Some of them require very expensive equipment. But today, many of these ways of examining a work of art are done in a laboratory, often associated with a major museum. Harvard University with the Fogg, the National Gallery, and of course, as we'll be hearing, the Institut Royal du Patrimoine in Brussels. That's the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Brussels. So you can see here the list. We said X-rays or radiography, ultraviolet, which you can see is abbreviated UV, infrared reflectography. Now, this is one of the most exciting, relatively new discoveries. It was actually developed out of military technology, as I understand. And we abbreviate that IRR. And this is distinct from just an infrared, because you can see so much more beneath the surface. It is a different wavelength. It goes beyond the infrared. And then Dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating. And this is done primarily at the Holtz Institute, the Wood Institute at Hamburg. And the scholar who does this is Peter Klein. So what we have here for a detail is a small detail of a painting. You see it's a painting by you can see it's a painting of St. John the Evangelist's chalice. It's painted by Hans Memling in the later 15th century. And you can see parts of the visible surface as well. It doesn't mean that you can't see any of the paint layer, but essentially you're seeing through and seeing more. So as you look at this, you see these lines here. And that is what is being revealed by infrared reflectography. You can see the underdrawing, the drawing that the artist created beneath the surface of the paint. He would do a drawing, and then he would paint over it. One of the interesting things about Memling was for a long time they thought, oh, he's got these perfect, smooth, ideal surfaces. And then when they could do the infrared reflectography, they discovered that his underdrawings were often very scribbly. He is a virtuoso who could just indicate, okay, I'm going to put the sword here or the chalice here or something, and then paint. And sometimes also when you're doing this, you can distinguish that the underdrawing may have been done by, say, his workshop copying his design because it's much tighter. In this case, as you can see, it's quite free. And you can see that he had the chalice placed a little bit differently and then changed that. X-rays have been done for a long time, probably almost since they were X-rays. And it's very useful because artists of the past often painted their underpaintings, their highlights of beneath the final surface of the painting using lead white paint. And of course, lead white is no longer it's poisonous. So safety regulations say you can't sell this and use it anymore. But these dense, heavy metal materials, such as lead white or some of the cadmium colors, will block X-rays, just like bone being very dense will block X-rays. And so when you take an X-ray, you can see this as a white image. And here is a detail from a painting by a 17th century Italian artist named Caravaggio. And you can look at this and you can see this boy, screaming and running away from the saint who is about to be martyred, and another figure in the foreground. But if you look at the surface beneath, and let me pull up a little larger image. If you look at the image that was created by the X-ray, you see an entirely different figure standing there. This nude figure with his arms outstretched, his legs apart. The artist changed the painting. Was it because the patron objected for some reason, or did he think it would be more dramatic another way? People could argue about that if there is no documentation. But as you can see, he originally had a different figures in that painting. Ultraviolet. Now, when you use ultraviolet to look at a painting, and ultraviolet has very short wavelengths that are beyond the visible spectrum, it reflects off the surface varnish, and most paintings have been varnished at one time. Both oil paintings and even tempera paintings often would be varnished to protect the surface and maybe give it a gloss. So it would reflect off the surface varnish, and it fluoresces. And as you can see, it reveals retouches or the later painting over the original surface. And, when you look at it, you see all these sort of blotchy spots in the ultraviolet photograph. And that's where paint has probably been flaked off from the original, has been lost over time or some damage. And someone else in the past has just painted over those places. Or sometimes they just paint over, and we'll see an example in a minute. Sometimes they will simply just paint over what the original artist painted for one reason or another. And this will be very interesting, I think. This is a painting by the very famous Italian artist Raphael, and it is in Budapest. And it's a picture of the Holy Family, as you see, and it was restored in 1982. And you see in the black and white photograph, this is the photograph that was done with ultraviolet. And the ultraviolet areas appear as black areas. So you have all of these black spots like around the hairline of Mary, or on the face of John the Baptist, and little spots all over. You see there's one on St. Joseph's head. these black spots show places that it was retouched, possibly because of paint losses. But you'll notice that something's really interesting. It's not just random damage. We see this whole that whole background area of the sky at the top has been painted out. And you look over here and you've got blue sky there. Was that because of damage? Well, they removed the repaint or the retouches, including that entire area. What's beneath that surface? What was painted out? So they took an X-ray, and as you can see on the X-ray, you can see these clouds and little angels. They're still there. It wasn't that there were paint losses they were painting out. They were actually painting out the work of Raphael. So when they used the X-ray, this revealed that there were these little angels on the clouds. And they cleaned off the retouches, they restored the painting, they cleaned the painting, did their own restoration, and now the painting is probably much closer to how it originally looked, with Raphael's little angels at the top corners. We call these little baby angels with wings a putti. One is a puto. They're little, usually baby boys, who derive from classical cupids. Or Eros figures, classical loves, and then they are transformed into little, very cute little Christian angels. Why were they painted out? Well, I don't know. Maybe somebody thought they were too cute. We don't know. But now the angels are restored. Infrared reflectography is one of the, I think, great technological discoveries. Essentially, they're using long wavelengths, as you can see, between 900 and 2500 nanometers, that are beyond the visible and beyond the infrared range. So it's not just infrared photography, it's infrared reflectography. There's an extra R in it. It goes beyond the infrared. And they have been developing different video comms that can see longer and longer wavelengths. So this technology has been improved over the years. I believe it started in the late 60s, 1960s, and has really taken off. It is just a very important branch of technological studies. What it does is these wavelengths will pick up carbon-based underdrawings. And of course, underdrawings just means drawings beneath the visible surface of the paint. So if the artist is drawing in black chalk or some kind of paint that is carbon-based, it will pick it up. Now, as it turns out, many of the painters from what we call the early Netherlandish period in the 15th century in the Netherlands did use carbon-based underdrawings. So we found out a lot of information about their working techniques. In other places, people may not use as much carbon-based drawing, but this has been really exciting. So let me give you an example. Hans Memling again. This is a little portrait that is in the National Gallery in London. And here is the picture of the hands showing, this was photographed using infrared reflectography, and it's showing the underdrawing. And you can see once again how scribbly Memling is. He has these strokes that show kind of where the hand will be, but then when he actually painted it, he expanded it and enlarged the hand. And then there's all these little scribbles on the surface, some of which you can figure out what they mean. I think these sort of curving lines that go around the fingers probably are showing that there's supposed to be volume there. We're supposed to have this, very three-dimensional. And then you can see that he painted the little ledge on which the book rests, and he just, sort of put some strokes through there. And then, of course, painted the book on top. And once again, he sort of outlined where he's going to have it, but very, very freely. So that's really fun. It really does tell you about the working method of the artist, these very free, sketchy underdrawings beneath the smooth, serene surface. Dendrochronology simply means tree ring dating. And you all know that when you do a cross-section of a tree, you cut down a tree, if you want to know how old it is, you count the rings. Well, this is a bit more than counting. When a panel is cut that would be used in furniture, rafters, timbers in buildings, or in the wooden panels that serve in many times and places. And in this case, 15th century Netherlandish painting usually is painted on panels or pieces of wood. When they cut them along the edge, you will see bits of the rings. Now, they're going to cut off the sap rings, the outer rings where the sap rises. And so what you have is what they call the heartwood. Now, what can you do with this? You can come up with approximate datings for the felling of the wood, for the felling of the tree, and then you can come up with a possible date for when the painting was painted. Let me go into that a little bit more. How can they know the date from this? Well, what the people at the Wood Institute have done is they have found wooden objects that date back centuries, and they have been able to match up the trees in a certain area. And that's very interesting. When they first started doing this with early Netherlandish painting, they got some really wonky dates. They didn't make any sense. And then they realized what was going on. The wood wasn't local. Most of the early Netherlandish paintings are on panels that are made from Baltic oak. The wood is imported from what is today Poland. And when they used the dating for Baltic wood, it just worked beautifully. And they would have, for example, buildings or pieces of furniture, some of which are dated, and they would use the wood from this period because tree rings are not identical. For example, if there's a drought or there's other kind of environmental influences on the way the tree grows, you're going to have the wider and narrower tree rings, and you can see you can line these up with the master chronology, as they call it. They've made this whole chronology, and as you can see, they're in computers now, and compare and say, okay, this section goes with this piece of wood. We know the trees were all growing at that rate, and then they have to make an estimate about how much sapwood was cut off, because they're going to have the heartwood, the part that's in the center and radiating out from the center. But you don't know if they just cut off, say, 2 rings, or do they cut off, more rings. So they make an estimate. And the estimate, of course, would be based on, looking at a lot of different objects. And that provides an approximate date when the tree was cut down. And then they make a judgment, based on various things, of approximately how long did they usually leave this wood before they painted on it? How long did it cure? For a lot of times, certain periods in time, they may say 8 years or 10 years. And that gives them an approximate date for the painting. Now, we don't know that it's that exact date, and there are some people who want to make it exact. But the people who actually do this, such as Peter Klein at Hamburg, are very clear about how exact it is, that there are some approximations within it. But one thing it can tell you, if the wood comes from a tree that was cut down after the death of an artist, by decades, for example, you know that artist did not paint that painting. We know there are some occasions when wood has been around for a long time, and somebody 100 years later may paint on that wood. And the style will say, okay, we can't use dendrochronology to date this painting. But there was a very interesting discovery that was made in paintings by Roger van der Weyden, who was a 15th century Netherlandish artist, whom we will be having in this course. There was a triptych, a 3-panel altarpiece, and there were 2 copies of this. One of them is in Berlin, and one of them, the panels have been divided between Granada in Spain, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art has one panel. That's in New York. And what they have done is examine the Dendrochronology, and lo and behold, they thought that these were 2 paintings by Roger van der Weyden, or by Roger van der Weyden and his workshop. They were just so very close. They found that the wood dated from much later than Roger van der Weyden's death. They think that the approximate time that the painting was painted would have been in the 1490s, around 1499 or 1496. And Roger van der Weyden died in 1464. He couldn't have painted the painting. Another very useful technology is dendrochronology. Now, this is done at the Hamburg Holz Institute, Wood Institute, and the person who does a lot of this is Peter Klein. That's Klein. And dendrochronology is tree ring dating. Now, you all know that when you cut a tree, you can see the rings, as you can see in the picture. And if you want to know how old the tree is, you count the rings. Well, there's more to be found out from tree rings than just that. As you can see, the tree rings have different widths and configurations, and that would be based on their environment. For example, if there was a drought, the rings might be very tiny because the sap wasn't rising as much in a drought. They have been able to examine wooden objects, rafters of houses, furniture, things like this that can be dated, back for centuries, and for a particular time and place make master chronologies of what the tree rings would look like. Now, when you make a panel for a work of art, or a piece of wood for a piece of furniture, or you're cutting the tree for a rafter for a house, or whatever you're doing, you don't use every scrap of the wood. You're cutting off the sap wood, the outer rings, and then of course you're cutting off the bark. And so one of the things is trying to estimate how much sap wood has been cut off. And they do that. And then they take these master chronologies, as they call them, that are based on actual wooden objects that are datable. And they take, for example, the panel, the piece of wood on which a painting is painted, and they compare them. And they can come up with an approximate felling date for the tree. They have to estimate that so many rings have been cut off. Now, from there, they also make an estimate of how long would the wood have cured before it was used for painting. And for example, in my period, they usually, 15th century Netherlandish, they usually use about 10 years. I think sometimes they use a little less, like about 8 years. This gives us an approximate date of the painting. Now, you have to be flexible about this. Obviously, someone can keep a piece of wood for 100 years and, reuse it. And sometimes this happens, and the style is, so much, so different from the style that it would have been had the actual date of the wood had it been painted at the same time. We know, it's just too far apart to be it. I should also tell you something else. When they first started doing this, some of the paintings, the dates were really wonky. They were really strange, and they didn't seem to correspond with what we had dated paintings. And then they realized what the problem was. In the Netherlands, they weren't using the local wood. They were importing it. They were importing it from the Baltic area, from what is today Poland. And so when they used the master chronologies for Baltic oak, things really started to work. Okay, you can't get maybe the exact date this thing was painted exactly in 1452. You got to have a little leeway, but it does give you a lot of information, and you can use this judiciously. And I'll give you an example. One thing that is obvious is that a painter cannot paint on a piece of wood that was felled or cut down after his death. So if you have a panel of a painting that dates decades after an artist died, you say, oh my goodness, it can't be by the artist, and maybe that you thought it was. And there is an example of paintings by Roger van der Weyden, which there were 2 copies, and we thought they were both by Roger van der Weyden. And when they did the Dendrochronology, they found out that one set of painting is undoubtedly by Roger van der Weyden, but the other set, the wood was decades later. The wood was cut down decades later. They found out that the painting was probably made in the 1490s. Now, Roger van der Weyden died in 1464. We also know where the painting was, or one of the paintings were, around the mid-1440s. It was in Spain, in the Burgos Abbey of the Miraflores. And so that painting would not have been available to Roger van der Weyden's son and grandson, who were also painters, to copy. And we think now that it was painted, that the copy was made in Spain at the orders of Isabella the Catholic, the Queen. And we have a good idea of who may have made the copy. There's a Flemish artist who moved to Spain and was a court painter to the Queen, and there are some records that he made copies for her. So Juan de Flans possibly is the person who did an excellent copy of paintings by Roger van der Weyden. So that changed the scholarship of those 2 particular triptychs, 3-paneled altarpieces, considerably.